The hot afternoon sun cast a glaring, unforgiving light on the busy downtown street. The sound of distant traffic buzzed in the background, but for Officer Daniel Brooks, the only thing that mattered was the woman standing in front of him. She was tall, composed, dressed simply in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks. There was an air of confidence about her, but to him she was just another person walking down the street, someone easy to ignore, easy to belittle. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, a subtle smirk crossing his lips. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Brooks said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension only someone with a badge could afford. "You can't park here. You're blocking traffic." She stood still for a moment, her eyes meeting his, but she didn't say anything right away. The calmness in her demeanor only seemed to fuel his sense of power. She had done nothing wrong. Her car was legally parked, but he saw an opportunity to exert control, to remind her who was in charge. A power trip. "I'm parked in the spot clearly marked for visitors," she replied, her voice smooth but firm. Brooks stepped forward, scanning her with a look of judgment that she could feel even before the words came out of his mouth. "Yeah, well, that's what they all say," he sneered. "You know, it's funny how people like you always think the rules don't apply. Maybe you should read the signs before you get out of your car." The casual cruelty in his words hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't new to this kind of treatment. The silent judgment, the casual racism that crept into every interaction. She had faced it before, and while it was painful, she had learned long ago that responding with anger rarely solved anything. She was different. She had learned to rise above. But this moment, this was different. The condescension in his voice, the assumption that he could control her, that he could speak down to her. This time, she wouldn't let it slide. She looked at him, the faintest flicker of anger behind her eyes, and then she took a deep breath. "You don't know who you're talking to, do you?" she asked, her tone quiet yet strong. She could see his confusion. His smirk faltered just for a second, as if he hadn't expected her to respond that way. But instead of backing down, she continued, her voice unwavering. "Let me make one thing clear. I'm not your typical target." For a brief moment, Officer Brooks glanced at her, still unsure of what was going on. He was used to people apologizing, scrambling to explain themselves to avoid confrontation. But this woman wasn't doing any of that. She was standing her ground, not in fear, but in calm defiance. And something about that seemed to get under his skin. "Yeah? And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it?" he asked, scoffing at her boldness. His posture grew more aggressive as he took another step forward, his hand resting on his belt where his gun holstered. A subtle, yet clear display of power. The air between them thickened with tension. She could feel it. His need to control, his hunger for dominance. It was always the same. Men like him, with their badges and their positions of power, believed they could push people around because they were above reproach. He was used to getting away with it. But she wasn't like the others he had encountered. And soon he was about to learn that the woman standing before him wasn't someone he could bully into submission. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the entire world had decided to hold its breath. Officer Brooks stood there, still glancing at her with that smug, self-righteous look on his face. But this time, there was a slight shift. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but something about her reaction unsettled him. "I said you can't park here," he repeated, his voice louder now, less patient. His eyes flicked toward her car, as if inspecting it for any signs of fault he could use to assert his authority. "You need to move it. Now." She didn't answer right away. The words he was saying were familiar to her. She had heard them, or something similar, too many times before. But this was different. His tone, the dismissive way he spoke, the quiet judgment in his eyes. It was as if he believed she didn't belong here at all. A sense of unease crept into her chest, mixing with the familiar anger that came with being treated like an outsider in her own city. She stood her ground, refusing to let his words push her back. She had been through far worse in her life, had fought for everything she had. But this subtle, daily degradation, it was harder to brush off. "You've got a lot of nerve," she thought to herself, fighting the urge to snap back with something sharp. "Don't let him see you angry. Don't give him that power." Her mind raced, trying to find the right response. Something measured, something calm, but it was becoming harder. The longer he stood there, the more his presence felt like a weight on her shoulders. The look in his eyes, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, was maddening. Brooks shifted his weight, glancing at her car once again, making sure to shake his head as if she had done something truly unforgivable. Then his eyes narrowed, and the smile, if you could even call it that, widened slightly. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked almost smugly, as if he had figured out a secret she didn't know she was keeping. She could feel the subtle insinuation in his words, the suggestion that she didn't belong, that people like her didn't get to park in certain areas, didn't get to take up space in his world. No one had ever asked her that question in such a way. It was the kind of question wrapped in 1,000 assumptions. And the way he said it, like he had already decided the answer in his mind, made her want to laugh in his face. But she didn't. She simply looked at him, refusing to let her emotions take over. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice steady, though a sharp edge lingered in the words. "And you should be careful about making assumptions." Brooks chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Careful? That's rich. Maybe you should be careful, ma'am. You don't know who you're talking to." He took another step closer to her, the tension growing thicker between them. His body language was a clear signal. He was ready to escalate this. She could see it in the way he clenched his jaw, in the way his hand lingered by his belt near his weapon. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her with words. He was preparing himself to make her feel small. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, and she could feel her pulse quicken. The growing anger inside her was difficult to suppress, but she couldn't let herself lose control. Not now. "His words have no power over you," she told herself silently. "Stay calm. Stay calm." But it was harder now. Her body tensed, ready to react. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the frustration that had been building all day threatening to spill over. "Why is it always like this?" she thought, her mind flashing back to the countless times she had been made to feel less than, invisible, as if her worth was never enough. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. She took a deep breath, pushing the anger down. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, quieter now, but with an edge of authority that caught his attention. He stepped back, surprised by the change in her tone. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was fleeting. He quickly recovered, his pride still intact. "Whatever. Move your car or I'll have it towed," he barked, clearly irritated by the exchange. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at him, feeling the simmering tension in the air. She could feel the familiar heat of injustice, the unfairness of the situation. His words didn't just hurt, they insulted her intelligence, her experience, her very being. But he would learn soon enough that underestimating her would be his biggest mistake. The tension in the air was palpable now, thickening with each passing moment. Officer Brooks was no longer just annoyed. He was visibly frustrated. The woman's calm response, her refusal to cower, seemed to challenge everything he believed about his authority. He had dealt with countless people like her before, those who tried to defy him, tried to make him feel like they were equal, but they always broke. They always fell in line. And yet here she was, standing tall in front of him, unwavering. He could see the confidence in her eyes, the certainty in her posture. Something about her quiet strength grated on him, made him feel small in a way he wasn't used to. "Listen, ma'am," he said, his voice growing more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play, but you need to move that car. Now." Her eyes narrowed slightly. The sense of calm she had been holding on to was beginning to crack. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. This was an attempt to strip away her dignity, to force her into a box she didn't fit in. He had no idea who she was, who he was talking to. But he wasn't done yet. His next words came out with a sharp edge, designed to cut deep. "You think you can just park here, like you own the place? People like you don't belong here, you know?" His voice was dripping with condescension, as if he had unlocked some kind of hidden truth. She stiffened at the words. There it was. The racism she had been silently battling her entire life. The assumption that because she was black, she couldn't possibly belong in spaces like this. That her presence here was an anomaly, something that didn't fit the narrow, twisted world he had created in his mind. She felt the sting of his words, the weight of every racist remark she had ever endured. But something inside her shifted. The anger she had felt moments ago began to boil over, replaced by a fierce, quiet resolve. She wasn't just going to stand there and take it anymore. "People like me," she said, her voice controlled but heavy with meaning. "You have no idea who you're talking to, officer." Brooks looked at her, still too sure of himself, too blinded by his own bias to realize the power of her words. He smirked again, his chest puffing up as if he were proud of what he'd just said. "Yeah," he continued, his tone laced with superiority. "You're just another angry person, aren't you? Probably here for a handout, thinking you deserve special treatment because of your situation." The implications of his words hit harder than anything he could have imagined. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but now it wasn't just about the insults. This was about the way he had diminished her entire existence. He saw her as nothing more than a stereotype, a story he had already written in his mind. But this wasn't her story. The internal fire that had been simmering inside her for so long was now fully ignited. She could feel the resolve settling into her bones, the calm authority that she had worked so hard to build rising to the surface. This man, this officer, was underestimating her in the worst way possible. "You think you know me," she said slowly, locking eyes with him. "But you don't. You don't know anything about me." For a moment, Brooks didn't react. His face was a mixture of arrogance and confusion, as if he still couldn't quite figure out what was happening. His bias had led him to believe she was just another angry woman, a target for him to push around. But now, as she stood in front of him, her resolve as strong as steel, he began to realize something was different. "I'm not your average target," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I don't play by your rules. I don't bow down to people like you." A slight shift passed over Brooks's face, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. His eyes flickered with hesitation, but he quickly masked it with another sharp command. "Move the car," he repeated, his voice less certain now, the aggression starting to fade as confusion took its place. He was used to authority. He was used to winning, to bending people to his will. But this woman, she wasn't like the others. She stood there, staring him down, her resolve unshakable. She knew the fight was far from over, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't a passive victim. She wasn't going to wait for someone to save her. She was ready to stand her ground, to reclaim her dignity in the face of his hate. "Maybe you should rethink that request," she said quietly, but the weight of her words hung in the air. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until you understand just who you're dealing with." Brooks' confusion deepened, but before he could say anything more, she reached into her bag and pulled out something small, just a piece of paper folded neatly. She didn't say anything, but as she handed it to him, his face changed. He unfolded the paper, and his expression shifted in real time as he read what it said. "Commander of the 1st Division, U.S. Military." For a split second, his face paled. His gaze darted back to her, and for the first time in this entire exchange, she saw a flicker of genuine recognition. She wasn't just any woman on the street. She wasn't someone he could push around. She was someone who had earned the right to stand tall, and he had just learned that the hard way. As Officer Brooks stared at the piece of paper in his hands, his world tilted. He blinked, not quite believing what he was reading. "Commander of the 1st Division, U.S. Military?" The words swam in his mind, making him question everything. He looked back at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. She wasn't just some ordinary woman. She wasn't a person to be dismissed. The woman watched him closely, her calm demeanor unwavering, as if she had expected this reaction. She stood tall, the power in her identity now clear to both him and the few bystanders who had begun to take notice. She wasn't someone to be intimidated, and she wasn't someone who would back down. The air around them seemed to freeze, the once hostile environment shifting. Brooks, now pale, stood speechless, the realization dawning on him like a crushing blow. He had just tried to control someone who had been to places he could never dream of, fought battles he would never understand. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "I think you owe me an apology." The crowd around them, once indifferent, was now watching in stunned silence. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and the man who had tried to assert his dominance was now a boy who had just learned a harsh lesson. Brooks opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a realization he could hardly digest. "Do you still think I don't belong here?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. Officer Brooks stood frozen, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. The woman before him, once just a target for his arrogance, had now revealed herself as a top military commander. His mind raced, but the words he had planned to speak now seemed useless. The power dynamic had completely shifted. She wasn't just a civilian. She was someone who had earned the right to stand tall, and he had tried to belittle her without knowing a single thing about her. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice shaking. The crowd around them watched in stunned silence, and the shame that washed over him was undeniable. She didn't react with anger. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she spoke softly, but with a force that made his stomach drop. "You never bothered to ask. You assumed I didn't belong here." His face flushed as the reality of his mistake sank in. He had tried to control her, to put her in her place, and now he realized how wrong he was. "Let me make this clear," she continued, her voice steady and calm. "You don't decide who belongs. Your badge doesn't make you superior." Brooks couldn't respond. His pride was shattered, and her quiet strength had crushed him. "I'm sorry," he finally said. But it was too late. The moment had passed and the lesson had been delivered. As she turned to walk away, Brooks stood still, his arrogance gone, his lesson learned the hard way. In the days that followed, Officer Brooks faced the consequences of his actions. The news of his humiliation spread quickly, and soon an internal investigation was underway. His colleagues, once too afraid to challenge him, began to speak up. Brooks was suspended, his career hanging by a thread, as the public and his department condemned his behavior. For Commander Hayes, justice wasn't about seeing him suffer. It was about making him understand the impact of his actions. And she had done that, loud and clear. Her name spread across the media, and messages of support flooded in. People shared their stories of racism and injustice, inspired by her strength and grace under pressure. As the weeks passed, she reflected on what she had learned. She realized that standing her ground wasn't just about confronting others. It was about showing herself the respect she deserved. She had no need to hide who she was, and this experience had reaffirmed that. Justice had been served, but the true victory was in her growth. The understanding that power lies not in dominance, but in the quiet strength to never back down. As Commander Hayes reflected on the events, she realized that the real power came from standing up for what's right, even when the world seems stacked against you. The lesson wasn't just about confronting injustice. It was about staying true to yourself, never letting anyone diminish your worth. She had faced the challenge not with anger, but with calm resolve, proving that true strength lies in the quiet confidence to demand respect. And in the end, she understood that when we stand firm against injustice, we not only change the course of our own lives, but inspire others to do the same. If you believe in fighting for what's right, hit that like button